I was gonna make the joke and say when it's on your title.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. But yeah, I mean, I guess I can answer first. It's definitely a tough question, and obviously because we have a whole meetup topic surrounding it. But I don't know. I think I kind of want to jump in and kind of give my perspective of it, because I want to say working in this industry for, like I said, somewhere around 5 years, and to be a principal software engineer, I think it kind of shows that there's more than just experience to be there, and it really depends too on what team you're working on. So I mean, I don't call myself a senior software engineer. I don't consider myself as such, even though my title says, I have a title that is such. But maybe I should, and that's something that I think we can just open up to kind of discussion. But the reasons I think I shouldn't is because, again, my experience, and I think something that makes that should be a factor of someone who is a senior software engineer is, the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, everything that gathered through so many years of doing it. There's something that you can't just pick up from a book. Like you can't learn somewhere. It just comes from being a developer and working so many different teams, and just gathering that. The reason why I say I consider myself a senior software engineer, why I should, it's because in my team, I do behave in such a way, in the way that I am like one of the major contributors to the code base. I understand like the multiple stacks, everything that we use to a good level, and I think that's sort of required. And as we need it, also because we're growing, like, and we're building different things as we need. I am able to like pick up whatever language or framework that we need to use, and that's that's sort of required. Like a senior software engineer should be able to do that. And I can go on like different aspects, and I'm not saying that these are all checkboxes you need to check as a senior software engineer, but being able to identify code smells, this certainly comes from experience and making mistakes, right? But from my code base, I want to say that I do a good job of sort of knowing our code base and like what features we need to develop, and identifying like, oh, that's going to be a problem, or like, oh, I don't know if we can do that. And sometimes I feel a lot of pressure, because like I feel like that's my job to do that. If I don't identify, then we end up hitting a roadblock, and have to like pivot and lose a lot of time, right? So kind of related to that, be providing multiple solutions. I do also want to relieve some of the stress on myself, and because I don't have all the answers, but I want to be able to, for my role, to provide multiple solutions, and kind of open it to the team, like, hey, these are all the things I think this would be the best solution, and kind of break that down too when we do have a big feature to develop. Like, here's what I think we should, the way that we would tackle it. Kind of things related to that would be kind of breaking down like business requirements, and kind of like things that we need to do, and providing estimates, which it's not very agile, but like kind of like taking on those roles. So other things that might be working in the team. I think I also do a good job sort of mentoring and bringing other developers up to a good level. I think that's also part of being a principal or a senior engineer, and handling feedback well, giving feedback and handling yourself. So yeah, I want to say like these are all things that factors that you could consider, like every senior software engineer should do, should be part of, but it's not necessarily. And I think in sort of answering like, when can you consider yourself a senior software engineer? It also depends on the team you're on, because like kind of what I'm trying to communicate is that this role that I have, it works really well in the team, that I have and the responsibilities and the things that I have to do. I don't know if it'd be the same in other teams. I don't know if, me being in Quizlet, there's a lot of Quizlet people here. Like if me being there, like I would serve the same purpose. You know, I don't think I would be a senior software engineer there because of what people need. But for my team at Seaspan, I do fit that gap.
All right.
Yeah.
Are you passing it this way?
Whoever wants to go next.
Awesome. Thanks, Roberto. I really liked your perspective. When I think about what it means to be a senior engineer, I like to kind of examine it by breaking down the components of that. And so it's like, okay, what does it take to be a senior, right? What's implied with that senior title versus just regular engineer? There's clearly a lot of capabilities that being an engineer requires, right? And the senior title does imply some level of experience, and experience is accumulated. And then also I think the ability to convert those experiences and apply them going forward, right? So how can you have a little more future vision and see what's on the horizon to plan for things rather than just merely being reactionary? I think it also implies a level of leadership, which can be something that is happening at, in all roles and at all levels. But it's like, if you think about like when you were a senior in high school, right? You'd experienced lots of high school. You were a model and a leader to others and able to kind of guide and mentor them and bring them along with you. And there's some things that you didn't have to work as hard, because you'd practiced them enough and trained on them enough to kind of keep applying those skills going forward. So I think the same kind of mentality applies in being a senior engineer. And additionally, when I think, so I have a lot of engineers on my team that I manage and mentor, and when I try to evaluate whether or not people are ready to move up to the next level, looking for that promotion, like what gaps do they have? There's a lot of different areas that cross my mind, and it depends on the individual, like the different skills. I think mentoring others, that Roberto called out, is a big piece of it, right? It's kind of that loop of learn, build, master, learn, build, master, teach. I'm messing it up, but essentially you like learn how to do something and you figure out how to do well, and then you're able to teach that and share that with others. And I think that's a loop that once you've been all the way around, like starts to get you more in that motion of being a senior. And there's some autonomy related to it as well, right? If you have experienced things and got the hang of it, you don't have to necessarily reach out for help on those things, which isn't to say that senior engineers don't need to reach out for help, right? But I think it's also a broadening of the scope at which they're building their skill sets, right? So we're all always learning and growing, and how can we keep adding to our skill sets? And so for a senior engineer, it's going to start to maybe branch outside the team or outside the normal scope of their day-to-day activities and involve more people or more cross-functional partners, and providing that continued kind of expanded reach is definitely a quality, and doing it in a way that is sort of driven by themselves, right? Like we're all getting better at time management, okay? So don't feel bad at whatever level you're at with that. It applies. It's an area for growth at all levels and for all people. But I think it's like the scope keeps expanding the way when you climb the levels, and the amount of people that you have influence over or with, and you keep building on more of those experiences. And so to like when I was still doing engineering, and if I look back to when I had the title of senior, I was doing things across the whole stack. It was at smaller companies. And so, I was doing design and development and production releases and support. And I felt like, oh yeah, my scope, I've got it end to end. So that made me a senior. But in other cases, it was a small company and maybe I wasn't mentoring anybody. There were more things still to learn. So there's always more to learn. So I agree with Roberto's point about it can depend on the team, right? Or the company that you're in. That role can change. And one warning about titles, right, is that every company has their own thought process about what levels map to what titles. And I think it depends on the size of the company, and companies tend to over-title people a lot of the times, and it can give you the wrong idea of where you might be at when at another company, right? And I think, like Roberto said that. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. It's not about the title, right? It's not, because that's like a destination, and it's more about the journey. It's more about thinking about your growth and how you can continue to grow upon the skills that you gained and continue to share those with others. So there's my thoughts for now.
Cool. So I came with much less prepared of a spiel around this than the two of you. Congratulations. But I did write something a number of years ago, and I put in the chat. And I guess I would say, shortly, senior engineer is totally an overloaded term, right? Like, it means, like Genevieve said, a senior engineer at a 2-person startup or a 3-person or 10-person is different than a senior engineer at Google, right? And anyone who tells you differently doesn't know what they're talking about. But I think there's so many different ways. But if I had to pick one thing that would indicate that someone was senior to me, it would be their ability to kind of own an entire project or subsystem, right? So it's a big thing, and they own it. They don't necessarily need to execute on all of it. They might be reaching out to other people for help, but they have responsibility for it, from requirements gathering and initial discussions with end users to, building it, possibly testing it, designing it, obviously, architecting it, and all the way through to development and deployment. So that to me is something where if I can hand that to somebody, no matter who they are, like they're senior in that capacity in that team at that time for me.
Can I ask a question really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, we're open to them, so you're good.
So Dan, just one specific point. You mentioned that you expect a senior engineer to like own the entire like project or system, and you specifically mentioned talking to end users. Do you mind speaking a little bit more about that? Do you like there's like part of engineering responsibility or role?
So you cut out a little bit, Dylan, when you were saying you weren't sure whether talking to end users was a responsibility of engineering. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, to some extent, this shows where I've come from, right? Like, I've been a lot of like very small companies where customers were possible. But I would say, even if you are in a situation where because I've been in teams that were kind of full Scrum and Agile, in that case, the product manager is really the proxy, or the product owner is the proxy for the customer. And so, if your organization says, hey, engineers, you can't talk to customers, or we don't want to let you for whatever reason, the product owner is a great proxy. So I guess I would make that caveat of, you're essentially talking to your customers when you're talking to the people who are going to use your software, or the people who know people are going to use your software. Does that answer your question, Dylan?
You could also think of it like thinking like your users, right? The ability to think like them, even if you can't talk with them.
I will firmly say, I think every engineer I've ever met, and I definitely include myself, can benefit from talking to customers, because they do things in a way that you would never imagine. You're like, whoa, why are you doing it this way, right? Like, what's going through your mind? And they just operate in the world a different way than engineers do.
Right, I think that's a very good point, because I know that happens more frequently than you would think, especially like where I've worked for the most part. Sometimes it's not even like taken into consideration right away to actually check and develop that empathy and understand the user experience. It's more just like, well, we just have the business requirements, let's just build it and we're good. Because there's just a lot of things that are missing with the little details. And like I've encountered that a lot at work, so I think that's very valid. So we'll start opening it up to anyone who wants to ask questions. Otherwise, I got several that I can think of, so I want to make sure we get everyone else involved before I do that.
I wanted to share something. I remember working. I was able to find it, and I copied into a GIS to share. It's this is back when I was a Galvanize with some coworkers, and shared it out is sort of a kind of like a how do you level up from one level to another, and I don't want it to say like I don't know, kind of reading it, it seems a little pretentious of like, oh, senior must do all these things, and this is like, oh, that's what sets them apart. But I think it does speak to a way of sort of leveling up, and like if you are at a certain point, if you consider yourself a junior or mid, I think this kind of shows like of sort of ways of improving in certain areas. And I don't know if kind of related to what we're talking about was like the section of awareness. You know, I think a junior dev is not really aware of the impact of the feature or like the connection between the user, where a senior developer does have that kind of awareness and knows that connection a little bit more.
If I can jump in here, it's not necessarily a question, though. I might prompt Genevieve to follow up on this. So we have something really like that at Quizlet, a career ladder that gives guidance to people like me. I'm a mid engineer at Quizlet, and so it gives me very like concrete guidance as to how I would become a senior in Quizlet standards. And so I can say like, if your organization has something like that, it is a super valuable tool to figure out how you do that level up. I don't know if Genevieve wants to talk more about our ladder.
Sure. I'll try and talk about career ladders somewhat in general as well, which is what's really I really love about Quizlet, that we do indeed have one defined. And, you know, for being a still somewhat small to mid-sized company, that's kind of an accomplishment. Smaller companies, right, probably aren't going to have this well-defined ladder and like, here's how you level up, because they may not have a lot of people at the different levels for you to model yourself after. And if that's the case for you, I also recommend, you know, finding models out in the world, in the industry, on which to model yourself after. And it's really all about identifying kind of growth opportunities. You're going to have some natural skills, and you're going to have some areas that need a little more attention from you. I won't call them weaknesses, because, you know, we all just kind of have these tendencies, and working with the engineers on my team, some have tendencies one way or the other, and so they're going to just naturally be performing in some of the areas, and others, they do have to spend a little more intentional focus to grow themselves. And it helps to have that definition, you know, from like a career ladder leveling perspective, to understand like what the company is viewing as the different levels, right? Like we've talked about, it totally depends on the company. So kind of understanding what are the distinguishing features that they distinguish. But even if you don't have that, it's all about like skills, building your skill set, right? It's like having it's a tool belt, right? And how can you grow skills in all these different areas? And being able to identify areas and then seek feedback for those that you need to grow in is probably the most powerful tool there. And I think it's demonstrative of more senior level folks that they are doing that on their own, saying, oh, you know, I know I need to grow here. How can I, you know, give me some opportunities for that. Whereas a mid-level may not be able to see those because you haven't had exposure to it yet, or you're not really sure what the next steps to take are. And then that's where you hopefully, you know, can work with your manager or a mentor, or even seek out these kind of folks in the community to model yourself after and say, wow, they're doing that thing really great. How can I get to that, to doing that in that way as well, and start breaking it down. So I'll stop there for now.
That's a really good point, though. I'm glad it was brought up about like career ladders, and just that in general is a great framework to have, to sort of like understand when all else, like you can't really get much direction from anybody else. Like that would be great, just being able to Google and look online what career ladder frameworks are out there for different software developer teams. I know that we had this discussion like in Denver Devs maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. That was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to make this more of a discussion. I think because we have like a free account, that post is gone now. But it did, and it kind of sucks because it had great resources on a lot of this stuff. But I think that's great. Like that's a great word to like think about, career ladder, when you want to try to figure out your path.
I do want to double down on one point that I think someone mentioned, which is not a checklist, right? It's not like, oh, if you do X, Y, and Z, you become a senior. It doesn't work like that. I think that's important to know as well.
Yeah, I have definitely had people ask me like, so how many certifications do I have to get before I move to the next level? You're like, well, how many of the ones that you have you used like in a useful way, right? Like, so it can be a real thing. Like people certainly gravitate to the concrete details over sort of the more abstract ones.
I really love career ladders as well. And, I've helped build one for my company. I've looked at a bunch of other companies' ones. I really love the Mozilla one. Have any of you created your own personal career ladder? So that it's not tied to a specific company, it's tied to your own, your own desires for growth. So that way you can define what senior means to you. And that way you could define it before, and then later on, maybe you have a little bit of, what's the word? The anxiety of like, not feeling that you're there, but then you can cross yourself off and say, actually, I've hit what I called myself a senior before, so therefore I am a senior now.
I mean, this might just be like a white male privilege, but like I've not looked back since I got to that first level where I was able to execute on a project, right? And that doesn't mean, again, that does not mean that there aren't areas for growth for me. I think that kind of career ladder would be very useful in terms of mapping out where you actually really want to go with your career, as opposed to making you feel comfortable whether you're senior or not. The general people always say, where do you want to be in 5 years, right? Like, yeah, that's a typical interview question, and I have no idea, right? Like 5 years ago, I was in a totally different space than I am now. And, but anyway, I think a checklist of things you want to accomplish in your career, and maybe that's a better way to think about it, Brooks, is just like, hey, here are the things I want to do, right? I'd like to found a startup. I'd like to work at like a Google or something similar, right? Like, and back to Genevieve's original comment, right? It's not about the actual end destination, right? You might find that you get to Google and you're like, oh God, this place is horrible, right? Like, or this place is not where I thought it would be. That's probably more likely than thinking it's horrible because they have beanbag chairs and all that great stuff there. But the journey of like, what steps do I need to take, and that focus that you can get by setting a long-term destination. I'm writing a book right now, and I'll tell you, I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because it's the journey and the thinking, the clarity, and it will be nice to say, hey, I've written a book, but finding a way to enjoy the journey and setting goals that can help you walk down paths that you're going to enjoy is probably a better way. At least that's what I'd recommend.
Go ahead, Cam.
Hello. So for the panelists, a lot of folks on the call are early in their careers, either still in school or just graduated, maybe haven't landed their first dev job yet. Like, what advice do you have for these folks? Or like, I'm still pretty early in my career. Like, I'm not a senior yet. And I don't know. Should I be thinking about it? Should I not be thinking about it? What do you think?
My biggest advice would be own your own growth. I really like the suggestion of the personal career ladder because there's so many different destinations that a senior could end up being, right? Like, depends on the industry. It depends on, what your real strengths and interests are, right? Like senior front end dev, senior back end. I mean, there's so many varieties of what senior means, right? And so, but I like that idea of mapping it out for yourself and like what it means to you and giving you, goals to work through. But my biggest advice, like looking back on my own experience, is don't wait for somebody else to show you the way. Like, you have to be your own wayfinder and owning your own growth. And that can mean, stepping up to figure out, yeah, okay, like definitely look for role models and find mentors and be very proactive about figuring that out, but also really open to experimenting your way there and trying new things out. And even if you've invested a long time in something, and unless you're getting that joy that's going to keep guiding you, then it's okay to change. I mean, if you're early in this coding career and you're coming from a different career, right? Like, you already took the leap to enter into this world now, but it's a big, wide world and there's so many directions you can take it. And that's why, like, I got into it initially because I was like, I could end up in doing anything. Like, I've done healthcare, I've done GIS, I've done lots of consumer facing stuff. And, now I'm doing education and learning because that's really where my ultimate kind of passion, a lot of it lies. And so finding out where yours does, and you don't have to know it along the way, but just know that it's up to you to keep trying that. And don't fall into complacency because that will stagnate your growth. Like, stay focused on growth. I'm going to emphasize growth because I'm on a growth team. I have a growth mindset, but that would be my biggest piece of advice.
I can chime in too. I guess, my biggest piece of advice would be to realize, at least maybe I'll reframe that and say, like, what mistake I made was to think about it was about the code, right? It's very easy to think the code is very important because it's the work output, right? It's what we get paid to do. There's a lot of beauty in well-written code, but fundamentally, I think that we're not actually paid for code, we're paid for problem solved. And so keeping an eye on the problem that's to be solved, and that may involve a manual process, it may involve code, it may involve a third-party tool, it may involve a library, it may involve a combination of all those, but being open to that and not focusing too much on the code. Like I used to do, like, I read books about design patterns and all that stuff, and it's beautiful, but it's only beautiful in service of the end goal, which is serving the people around the software.
Yeah, I really love that. I sort of realizing this more in this team that I'm in, because it was sort of created by somebody who had some experience but wasn't really sure what he was doing. And when I came to this team, I felt like I had a lot to bring in, and what I was trying to bring in was like solutions and like make things work. And it wasn't more about like what's the best tool to do this. It's just more like, hey, this company needs this. Can you build it? Yes, let's find out how, and let's just build it. It's not about the cleanest code or anything. It's just about how do you really help the company in the business. So yeah, I think that's really great. And one advice that I would give, I think also going along with growth, is just say yes. Like as far as like just take on challenges and say yes. I want to say that most of the things that I've said yes to, I didn't know if I could do it. And honestly, half the time I was terrified. Even to this, like first Kim was like, "Hey, do you mind doing this?" I'm like, "No, I'm not a senior. Like, why would I do?" Like, I was terrible. Like, then I'm like, "Wait, no, yes, I'll do it." And because I think this even in itself is a great growth opportunity. And I really think I got to where I'm at by saying yes. As far as like, "Hey, we need to do this. Can we do it?" I'm like, yes, let's do it. I think we can figure out a way. And like jumping in, being realistic, of course, and not, I'm not saying like just fake it till you make it kind of thing necessarily, but really be open to things. And don't be afraid.
I would just follow up that yes. I think it's very important to say yes, but do it consciously and don't be abused, right? There have been times in my work life where I've said yes too much because I thought I was going to take one for the team, and then I end up working too much. That's one place that I would say, feel free to work extra overtime, unpaid overtime, as long as you do that with your eyes wide open. The company is not going to they might give you a pat on the back, right? Like, don't expect much more than that. So that's just my cynicism.
I think it goes along with saying yes is don't be afraid to fail, right? Because the most learning and growth actually comes from making mistakes. Like, think about the last code mistake you made, right? Even code mistake or any mistake, right? But think how much you learn from that experience, right? And it's that ability to learn from those failures and be brave enough to keep trying those things and branching out that's gonna grow you the fastest and the most. Like, everything you already can do and solve quickly, like, that's great to build on, but is it growing you?
I think that's a very, very good point. And I think the most important thing, because I've learned this in my experience, is that when you do make that mistake, make sure you note it right away so you never make that mistake again. Because there have been times where I do that, and luckily I get that feedback via Slack or GitHub, so I can track it a lot better. When like my senior engineer will tell me, like, don't ever do this again. This is not how you're supposed to do this. And like, this is in regards to maybe like a legacy system that already has poorly smelly code that like you shouldn't really just copy and paste because it will look like the rest of the code base. Like, when those kind of times come up and they are very like stern and kind of are very like aggressive that you realize that now, then that's like a very important time to think to yourself, I should probably write this down, reflect on it by learning a little bit more about this than I did the day before, so I don't make this mistake again.
I mean, I'm not part of the panel or anything, but I think my like advice would also be like, in line with saying yes would be to go after things that you don't think you're ready for or necessarily completely qualified for, especially when it's like applying for jobs and it's like, oh, we want 5 years of C++ experience or whatever. It's like, if you know enough to not make a fool of yourself, you're probably in a good enough place. And if you can show the hiring manager, whatever, that you are excited about what the company does and that you're willing to learn whatever it is you need to learn, that can go so much further than actually having the years of experience. So, don't let the requirements hold you back.
One of my biggest beefs with job listings is that, like, it's like advertising, right? 50% of it doesn't work. 50% of job listings don't matter. Like, the 50% of the requirements are like, oh gosh, I wish hiring manager, I've been a hiring manager, and you're like, oh, I wish I had someone who could do this and this and this and this. But as a candidate comes in and they can only do half of that, you can make it work, right? Especially if they're enthusiastic. The issue, of course, is that as a candidate, you don't know which half is what are the real sticking points, right? And that would be a thing that I would recommend to anybody doing job hunting, is talk to someone on the inside. And I've done this myself. If you can get someone on the inside, it can help bump your resume up. It can help you understand if the job's filled. It can help you understand what of those 10 requirements are actually, like, what's a roadblock, right? Like C++, knowing 5 years C++, for some jobs that might be nice to have. For some jobs that might be an absolute roadblock, right? Like, you got to have C++ expertise. And we're really bad at writing job descriptions, and I am too. So.
I have a question. So I wanted to ask, what do you all feel like was a turning point in your careers where you maybe just felt like, confident in your abilities or not feeling like a junior engineer anymore, or whatever it is? I know we all kind of go through that imposter syndrome, whether it's 5, 10 years, 20 years of experience, but yeah, I just wanted to know if there was like a specific project or job that you had that kind of gave you that feeling of confidence.
I can start. I want to say it goes in waves. Some days I feel great. I feel like, oh my God, I'm a genius. How could I figure this out? Like I feel like after the days of work, I'm like, wow, that was so good. I'm like really smart. And then some days I just feel like, I don't know, the simplest thing. And for whatever reason, I'm just stuck in the same problem for like hours and I can't figure it out, or I meet somebody who talks about what they did and it makes no sense to me. I'm like, I thought I knew something, I don't know if there was specific. I think this last job, this job I'm in right now, definitely helped. And coming into it, I was like, what am I doing? Like, am I really gonna be able to be the principal for this company and like actually provide? And I think this company kind of this last job is really what provided me. So it was when I there was a requirement, like this thing that we needed to build, and we built like part 1 and it worked. And I had the responsibility on me, kind of like Dan was talking about how it's either the user or the project manager like checks in a year, like, hey, how are we doing this? I'm like, well, we got this and done, and we're still working on this, he's working on this, so maybe next week we'll have this. And like, you start feeling like, oh my God, I'm doing it. And then that, I don't know. So there are moments, when you actually take on the responsibility, you actually know stuff and you answer and you build things. It doesn't happen all at once. It's just kind of gradually, you're kind of accumulating all these things you're kind of learning. And at some point you sort of look back like, whoa, maybe I'm not a junior anymore.
Genevieve, you want to go next, or I'm happy to go? Okay, cool. So I would say 2 things. One is I did a stint as a contract. I've been about 10 years as a contractor in my life, as opposed to a full-time employee. And every new project I ever get on as a contractor, there's that moment, maybe 2 to 3 weeks in, where my stomach just sinks. I'm like, holy cow, I don't know what the heck is going on here, because it's usually a different team, different domain, all those things. So that comes back no matter, I did a project 4 weeks ago and it still came back, right? Like I was like, oh my God, it wasn't 2 weeks in, but so that's one thing on the side, right? An encouraging thing, right? The other thing is, I would say when I felt like I was a senior, it was a couple of years into my career, and we were working with this proprietary piece of software, and there was a problem that we couldn't figure out how to deal with it. We didn't have support. The documentation wasn't there. And I actually ended up decompiling a Java class or a set of Java classes to like figure out like what the right call was for this particular problem. And that to me is just illustrative of like the senior person who just like, I didn't know how to decompile a Java class. I Alta Vista'd it at that point. It was probably before Google. And it was just, you don't stop with problems, right? I've dealt with a lot of junior or new, I don't like to call them junior, mid-level developers who like will go up to the edge of the diving board and they won't jump off, right? Or they'll like look for someone else to help them jump off. A senior person, I can hand them something and they're going to jump right off and they're going to solve that problem.
Yeah, I upvote a lot of the themes here. I was thinking, I think this is some recency bias, but yeah, like a few weeks ago, it's like and it's like what Roberto was saying, right? Like it's up and down, and it's some days I call it, maybe controversially, but like the God dog principle. When you feel like that genius, you're like, I can solve the world. And then when you feel like the dog, you're like, I don't even know how to type on a keyboard. Like, what's going on? And to me, like computer science has always been, you're one or the other. And there's less gray area. But for me, I think like, so I kind of noticed even in the last year or so of my career, like suddenly people were asking questions and I was like answering them. I was like, oh, I have an answer for that. I have an opinion on that. And kind of noticed that about myself, and like even like being on a panel, and it's like, oh wow, I have some experience to reflect on, to share with you about. And that is kind of the turning point versus like thinking way back where it's like, oh, well, I need to ask this, or I need to go and seek this out. And it's not that there's not still things, like I'm definitely still learning new things as well. But I think I got to that point at some point along where it was like you're saying, I was able to just jump off the diving board, right? Like, and so. Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially since unfortunately we are over time. But that was a great last question to have, because yeah, I mean that was very insightful, and like I think we all kind of have that feeling. It sort of ebbs and flows on like whether or not we really feel confident, or other days where it's like, this is not my best, but I gotta keep on trucking. Well, yeah, thank you so much for attending today. Panelists, thank you so much for being involved and answering these great questions. This was, I'd say, a pretty good turnout, and I think that wraps it up today. So thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Hope you all have a good rest of your night. Get some food, get dinner. Take it easy.
Thanks for all the great info.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.